Hi. Today on the Shrewd Dudes Podcast Thursday live stream, we are going to talk about a few different things. In This Week in Satire, we're going to address the obvious racism of Biden naming the next cataclysmic hurricane after a gender-neutral, diverse black woman. In the rant of the week, we're going to talk about how the establishment and the scientific community has been manipulating and making fraudulent and unfinished or incomplete studies to try and push a specific narrative. This one is going to be specifically about the top surgery of young girls. So that's not going to be a pretty sight. And then finally, in the douche of the week, we're going to talk about Jacinda Ardern and finally address that fascist dictator over in New Zealand and what she wants to do to the rest of the world after completely decimating her own country. All of that and more on the Shrewd Dudes podcast. All right. So, as I said, and as you might have noticed, today's just me. Danny has left me. No, Danny has gone off to have a previous engagement that he had already agreed to when he forgot what day it was on. We shall all shame him collectively for his sin. Now, for those who are just joining the channel, for those who have not watched us before, Thursday evenings, every Thursday, usually at 8 o'clock Mountain Time, but today it's 7:30 because I can prep on my own faster than with Danny because I don't have to kind of go back and forth and wait for him to show up. So, kudos to me. But usually, of course, we're on at 8 o'clock. We live stream on Facebook, on my personal profile, and on Twitch because I'm not paying for a multi-streaming platform just yet. So if you have any questions, please put them on Twitch. I cannot answer them on Facebook because this is a solo show, and if I open it up, then I have to do a whole bunch of different things. So please ask your questions on Twitch. The link, of course, can be found at twitch.tv/ShrewdDudesPodcast. So check that out. Listen, talk, comment, ask your questions. I'm going to try and get to them as soon as I can. But being this is a solo show, and I'm trying to engage with the show as it's going along, please be patient. I'm not going to be able to respond right away unless by some miracle I'm watching. So, that being said, I don't really have anything of note that happened over the past few days. Today was fairly miserable weather, but we ended a little early from work, so that was great. But, moving on to This Week in Satire. So, Biden vows the next hurricane to hit the United States will be named after a woman of color. So from the Babylon Bee, as Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida, Biden held a press conference to criticize the hurricane naming system and vow that the next major storm will be named after a woman of color. Get into the Biden voice. Seriously, Irma, Michael, Andrew, Ian, what's with all these white names, folks? Said Biden to several of his dead acquaintances, who he saw sitting in the audience. Why can't we have a Rosa Parks hurricane? Maybe an Oprah. For real. It's not a joke. Come on, man. The World Meteorological Association immediately responded to Biden's request and confirmed they have several names of influential women of color they hope to use for the next deadly tropical cyclone. At publishing time, sources confirmed that Hurricane Lizzo is scheduled to make landfall next week, and of course will kill millions. This is just cute. It's funny. It's ridiculous, but such as the Babylon Bee, and we love all of that. Hello, Shelley. I love you too. So, with that being said, this is, of course, in remarks to Joe Biden being ridiculous about his nomination for Supreme Court. of Ketanji Brown Jackson, because Ketanji Brown Jackson was only nominated, and she knows this, and everyone knows this, not because she was the most qualified, even though she was highly qualified, but she was nominated because she was a black woman. And that's racist. Because if you nominate only based on skin color and sex, then how do you feel like you've deserved that? Because how do you know that there wasn't a more qualified individual who was a man or who was a white woman or who was any of those things? You don't. You just know that of the black women of a smaller category, you were the most qualified. Were you the most qualified overall? Probably not. And then, of course, you utterly humiliated yourself when you could not answer or refused to answer what a woman was. So, this is all in reference to that. And I sincerely hope they don't start naming hurricanes after new black women. Yes, I know my flag's upside down. Thank you for notifying me. It's a symbol of a flag of a country and a nation in distress, because Canada is a nation in distress. Because, A, we still have blackface Trudeau as our leader. No, I would not. That's horrifying. That's weird. But thank you for people getting involved in the chat. This is very interesting. Obviously. Okay, sure. That's a strange response, but I suppose I'll take it. But can't talk forever about satire because we have to talk about serious stuff. So this week in the Rants of the Week, we're going to talk about some studies and how some of these studies have been pushed, especially one more recently, to push a certain agenda. So let's go over to that now.
Red alert.
So, from CBS News, top surgery drastically improves quality of life for young transgender people, study finds. Quality of life among young transmasculine people dramatically improves after receiving top surgery, a mastectomy procedure that removes breast tissue, according to a study by Northwestern Medicine. The study, published in peer-reviewed JAMA Pediatrics, honestly, they will peer-review anything that pushes their agenda, and of course, they won't peer-review anything that goes against it. We've talked about this in the past. It's shameful what the establishment has done to the scientific community. And we're going to address that today. So, is the first to show that top surgery is associated with significant improvement in chest dysphoria, gender congruence, and body image in transmasculine and non-binary teens and young adults, Northwestern Medicine said in a press release. The study compared two groups of patients ranging in ages from 14 to 24, one group of 36 received top surgery, and a control group of 34 received gender-affirming care, but did not get top surgery. Control group would technically be someone who has these gender-confused ideals, but instead of getting gender-affirming care, would actually get therapy and get sort of treatment and counseling to assuade them to reject these delusional hypotheses, because they are indeed delusional. But let's take a look at the study and what they're actually trying to show. So, of course, you could read through the entire study, and I read through a decent amount of it, but the big points to note. So, 81 patients, that's the total of everyone that they had involved in this study, and of those 81, 11 were lost to follow-up. So that's a fairly significant margin that were just lost. So that's first strike against this study. 36 surgical patients and 34 match control patients. The only problem was that after they did all of these things, they've only done follow-up after 3 months. So strike A, a certain amount of people that were participating didn't actually participate in the follow-up later on. And strike 2 is that they only followed up 3 months. If you're making a life-altering decision, if you're making any serious decision about your life, you are not going to have regrets unless it's a crazy, crazy bad decision. Unless it's a decision that is going to negatively impact you immediately. I should say that. Because this is a very bad decision, but it's not going to negatively impact them immediately. Now, of course, you could read reports, and I encourage you to actually watch the special done by Matt Walsh about talking about people who have regretted this surgery later on. But we don't have time to get into that, and it would be an entire section because today we're solely focusing on studies. So this is what happened. I'm going to go down to the discussion segment. Top surgery was associated with significant improvement in chest dysphoria measured by the CDM. And CDM was basically just this survey that said, does your chest make you feel uncomfortable? And then 3 months later, does your chest make you feel uncomfortable now? That's a survey. To say that this is put into a peer-reviewed journal is a joke. Significant improvements in gender congruence and body image satisfaction at 3 months post-op. Surgical complications were minimal and comparable with those in adult patients. Chest is far fewer complications than other transgender surgeries, and we can go into that in another time because, oh my gosh, the significant complications with those surgeries are immense and they will last a lifetime. If you have the opportunity, watch What is a Woman. The individual in that video is heartbreaking. The guy is absolutely devastated. Or no, it's a woman. It's a woman who looks like a man because they altered him to make him look like a man. They altered this person to make him look... I keep saying him. It's a she. This is a woman. This is what they're doing to our society. They're manipulating our language to alter how we talk about things. So, back to the study. We're talking about how they took this study and then they said, oh yes, this will be a permanent life-changing decision. Will be a permanent thing that you'll always be happy. No, that's not the case. Whenever they have these serious life-altering decisions and they talk a year down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, especially in adolescence, I believe the number is 91%. 91% of children and adolescents that were pushed into this by other groomer teachers or Munchausen's by proxy parents, they regret it and they revert back. But does this study mention that? Not once. Not once do they decide to mention that this is not something that lasts with them. This is a phase, and this is something that is pushed onto them by child abusers. But they have these studies. They have these falsified studies that push insignificant results because they want to push a certain narrative. If we look back just a few years ago, we talked about hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine back in 2020 was touted as this life-saving drug for COVID. And it did save a lot of lives when it was allowed to be used. The only problem is that the studies and the things that they pushed to say that hydroxychloroquine could not be used or should not be used and that it was dangerous to be used was information and studies like this, which has now been retracted, but it was only retracted after the push for hydroxychloroquine publicly had ended. This study, which had been debunked easily, but this was peer-reviewed. They said it was peer-reviewed, but the fact was that nobody had actually gone and looked into it. Nobody had actually gone and looked and discovered what they were trying to say, what their results were, because when they looked into their results, they found that it was entirely fraudulent and entirely made up. Because that's what they can do when they control the scientific establishment, when they control everything about it. When they say, well, we can say whatever we want, but it doesn't matter because we control it. Because they will listen to us because it's the science. Because it's our narrative. That's the problem. Is that when science gets connected with the narrative should not be guided, or the science should not be guided by the narrative. Sorry. What science should be guided by is data. Science should be guided by truth. And saying that, oh, well, they don't regret it 3 months down the road, but we're not going to look into it later. And whether or not they regret it later, that's not our problem. I don't see how that's actually helping people. It's not. It's hurting people. And I cannot abide by saying, yep, I'm going to go along with this. I'm just going to say, trust the science, and these children will be hurt and impacted for the rest of their lives. We talked last week about the Vanderbilt clinic and the damage that it was doing to children. And then when Matt Walsh and others uncovered what was happening, that they hid and they ran away. They deleted their website because they don't want you to know the damage that they're doing to kids. Because there is immense damage that is being done to children because of these surgeries, because of these gender transitioning hormones. No, Donnie, it's not benefiting more. There's no evidence that it's benefiting more in children. Transitioning a child, there's no evidence because there's no long-term studies on this. Because they're the guinea pigs. That's the biggest problem. Is that we don't know what the long-term effects are. We're guessing that they're guessing that this is going to help. But there's no evidence of that. Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad that I'm glad that with a little bit of back and forth, I'm glad that this chat has been helpful, or this chat has been engaging. Of course, if anybody has any other questions about any of this stuff, I'm glad to go into that. But today, as I said earlier, today is going to be a bit of a shorter show because today it's just me, and I'm gonna try as much as I can to have a back and forth with people in the comments, but that's gonna be difficult, especially considering this next section, because the news you may have missed is mostly just me reading. So I'm going to jump into the news you may have missed to talk about the news that you may have missed. So if you have any questions or commentary, please just let me know, and I'll try and address it as soon as I can. So, jumping into the first story of the news you may have missed. And I'm sorry if I have a bit of a delay that I'm talking about all this stuff, because usually, of course, I go back and forth with my co-host Danny, and he's not here, so he can usually fill in the gap when I'm doing the tech stuff. But, again, can't do that today. So, talking about the first story in the news you may have missed. NOAA director shuts down CNN's Don Lemon for linking Hurricane Ian to climate change. So there is this entertaining video, and it's just funny.
What effect does climate change have on this phenomenon that is happening now? Because it seems these storms are intensifying. That's the question.
I don't think you can link climate change to any one event. Okay. On the whole, on the cumulative, climate change may be making storms worse, but to link it to any one event, I would caution against that.
Okay, well, listen, I grew up there, and these storms are intensifying. Something is causing them to intensify.
Yeah. You can't just say, well, I grew up there, and so my subjective interpretation of what's going on is saying that they're intensifying, is saying they're getting worse. Guess what? There was basically 0 significant hurricanes in the past 2 years, aside from Ian. And so if we're saying, oh, they're intensifying and they're getting worse, wouldn't we also see more of them? No, that's because you're trying, just like the studies that we talked about before, you're trying to push your narrative ahead of the science. So Jamie Rome joined Lemon on his show to discuss the expected impact of Ian ahead of its landfall in Florida, with the Liberal host questioned how climate change is impacting the hurricane. Can you tell us what this is and what effect climate change has on this phenomenon? Lemon asked in regards to the storm's rapid intensification. He brushed the question aside. We can come back and talk about climate change. I'm talking about the here and now. You didn't talk. I'm just trying to get, you said you don't want to talk about climate change. What effect is climate change? That's the question. He then warned the news anchor against crediting climate change for any singular event. On the whole, on the cumulative, climate change may be making the storms worse, but any link to one event, I would caution against that. You cannot say that any of this is linked to these grandiose hypotheses of climate change. Like, the climate agenda has been struck down over and over and over again because they keep saying that these grandiose world-ending hypotheses are linked to the end of the world. Yes, the climate is changing. Yes, the environment is being altered. Is it being done by human effects? Very little. Will it have a massive effect if we change our greenhouse gas and our carbon emissions? Nope, it won't. Even by most generous assumptions, if we eliminated pretty much all carbon emissions, became carbon neutral, we would have an impact in the next 100 years on the average temperature by, I believe, about 0.2 or 0.3 of a degree. That's not enough to justify the millions upon millions that would die. Because if we went to carbon neutral, just like what's going to kind of happen in Europe this winter, there will be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, dead because they will not have adequate supplies of energy because they're not going to have access to oil and natural gas because of the pipeline that just blew up. We're going to address that in a couple stories. Another climate hypocrisy issue. New Zealand radio host under fire after clip of hypocritical teen climate warrior goes viral. New Zealand radio star is under fire for lapping at a climate activist who said that people should avoid unnecessary air travel just months after she herself had flown to Fiji. So a teenage activist mom wrote a furious letter complaining that her 16-year-old daughter had been bullied by News Talk's ZB, or ZB, I don't know how to pronounce what they're trying to do because I've never heard of this station before, Drive host Heather Duplessis Alan, and Greens MP Julie and Genter described the radio host's interview as BS. So this is the interview, at least the first section of it, because it's just so funny.
For example...
So we would have to apply to have, like, approved events to be able to fly for?
Well, that's one thing that you could look at doing.
Am I allowed to go to Fiji? Is that necessary?
In the current climate crisis, I don't think that that's necessary.
When was the last time you were on a plane?
I'm not sure. Maybe a few months ago, to be honest.
Where'd you go?
Fiji.
Izzy! Izzy! Don't you care about the climate, Izzy?
Of course I care about the climate.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Because it's all hypocrisy. Every of these mainstream, highlighted, celebrity climate change activists, every single one of them does not act it out in real life. Greta Thunberg didn't, and this person, Izzy Cook, who is basically the New Zealand version, or the Australian version of Greta Thunberg, is not following it either. Because they don't believe their own BS. They want rules for thee, but not for me, because I'm my own person, and I can act however I want as long as I tell the pitiful masses what they're supposed to do. So, Izzy's mother said Duplessis Alan did not give an S about climate change, and she should be ashamed of how she bullied my daughter. I'm assuming this is saying my and not by. She claimed the radio host had staged a gotcha moment. It's not a gotcha moment to say, so you're saying ban this. Yes. Okay, what did you do? Well, I did that. It's just hypocrisy. And of course, according to one Twitter user, she wasn't bullied. She was mocked for her hypocrisy. Yep, they just don't want to be mocked because they don't want to be called out on their BS. They don't want to be called out on their hypocrisy because that exposes them. And they cannot live with being exposed for the frauds that they are. Another organization which I wish was exposed for the frauds that they were, NATO. NATO vows determined response to deliberate reckless sabotage of Nord Stream. So Russia denies that it was behind the explosions, as does the United States, which says Moscow's suggestion it would damage the pipeline is ridiculous. Well, there's far more likelihood the United States would damage it than Russia. NATO on Thursday said the leaks from the Nord Stream gas pipelines appeared to be sabotage and vowed a determined response to any attacks on critical infrastructure. All currently available information indicates that this was a result of deliberate, reckless, and irresponsible acts of sabotage, the Western Military Alliance said in a statement. These leaks are causing risks to shipping and substantial environmental damage. We support the investigations underway to determine the origin of the damage. The statement said that the alliance was committed to prepare for, deter, and defend against the coercive use of energy and other hybrid tactics. Any deliberate attacks against the Allies' critical infrastructure will be met with a united and determined response. Yes, a united and determined response. Except A, we don't know who actually committed it, and the two most interesting and most likely culprits, the United States and Russia. The United States far more than Russia, because the United States actually makes a little bit of sense. It's just pure dang nasty evil. And then Russia is just stupid. Let's just break this down. If you didn't watch it, we covered this on Tuesday, and we actually did a more deep dive into this, which is a brief rendition, brief cover-up, recovery, and summary. If the United States did it, yes, it takes away the bargaining chip from Russia, but it also victimizes and exposes Europe to a lot of energy instability and potentially many dead from inadequate supplies of energy and choosing to either heat or eat, as people in Canada were forced to a few years ago when they had their own energy crisis in Ontario. If Russia did it, then Russia is trying to assume that the idea is that, oh, well, this is a false flag event. We're going to accuse NATO, we're going to accuse the United States of doing this, and then we're going to try and encourage more individuals to come into the war effort so that they don't have to have a draft to enter into the war against Ukraine or potentially against NATO in the future. But that would be exceptionally foolish, because why would Russia want a war with NATO? Like, Russia doesn't mind the brinksmanship with NATO. Russia enjoyed having the option of cutting off the supply of energy in coal and natural gas to Europe, because that was their trump card. Because they could say, yep, you can't sanction us, you can't do anything to us, because if you do, then we'll cut off your supply of energy and your people will freeze. Interesting, of course, that this happened almost to the day that another pipeline was announced that would go to Europe, which makes the likelihood of this being from a NATO country, or especially from the United States, all the more likely. And they probably planted it a while ago, and then when there was a Russian naval vessel in sort of around the area, then it's like, well, this is a good time, makes it look like the Russians did it. The funny thing was, of course, the Russians had a ship in the area, the Americans had a ship in the area, so up in the air, my vote is with the Americans. It just makes far more sense, because the Russians would be shooting themselves in the foot, and Biden has already said, yep, if Russia invaded Ukraine, then we would take out the pipeline. But speaking of Joe Biden being an idiot, Joe Biden asks for dead Congresswoman in gaffe during speech. The United States president appeared to forget that Jackie Walorski, the former Republican representative for the state of Indiana, had died in a car crash in August. So, Joe Biden made a blunder during a speech when he asked if a deceased Congresswoman was in the audience. The United States president made the gaffe at the conference on hunger, nutrition, and health after apparently forgetting that Jackie Walorski, the former Republican representative for the state of Indiana, died in a car crash in August. He looked around the room in Washington and said, "Jackie, are you there? Where's Jackie? She must not be here." The blunder saw White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre field a flurry of questions during the press briefing that followed. She repeated more than a dozen times that Ms. Walorski was top of mind for Biden, who was due to meet with the Congresswoman's family on Friday to sign a bill renaming a Veterans Affairs clinic in Indiana after her. Ms. Jean-Pierre did not acknowledge the president had misspoken and did not apologize for the error. My answer is certainly not going to change. It should change. Your answer should be, Biden has dementia and he doesn't know where he is half the time, and covering up for him is a full-time freaking job. Now, Jen Psaki did a better job of doing it than you, but your job is not that great because you have to cover up for the gaffes of someone who's not all there. It's saddening to see that the American president has lost it. He has basically no mental functionality, and he needs to be guided and told where to go at all times, and he's been seen shaking hands with the air and constantly looks like he's bewildered in the current situation that he's in. I'm not going to raise questions about the election because that would get it kicked off YouTube, but I think most people know how we feel about that. It didn't work. It doesn't work. It didn't happen. But that's all that's going to be said about that. But speaking about stupid stuff that happened in the United States, freaking cool! Lizzo plays James Madison's 200-year-old crystal flute. Crowds went wild as the singer played a few notes on the former U.S. president's flute on stage at the Washington concert. At a concert in Washington on Tuesday night, Lizzo paused her performance when a woman came on stage with a flute. Wearing a glittery bodysuit, the singer held the instrument carefully. "Wow," she said, holding it up to the audience. Lizzo explained, "It's crystal, it's playing out of a wine glass." She proceeded to play a note. As the crowd went wild, Lizzo trilled the flute while twerking. "I just twerked and played James Madison crystal flute from the 1800s, she told the audience after returning the flute. "We just made history tonight." In an Instagram caption to the video of the moment, Lizzo wrote in all caps, "It's literally an heirloom. Like, as a flute player, this is iconic and I will never be over it." So, this goes over the history of the flute, but that's not really necessary because talking about the event, twerking while holding an element of history, she's essentially saying, I'm claiming, or our modern society is claiming this item, we're claiming this history, and then we're defacing it. Our modern society has perverted and twisted and defiled so much. Like, she wanted, and those who were planning this event wanted to cause controversy. They wanted to say, well, there's this big, obese black woman who's twerking, who's being overtly sexual and basically wearing half of nothing. I'm not going to show the video because what she's wearing is disgusting. It's basically this like thong bodysuit where you can see half of her butt, which is not appealing on a woman of her size. Now, of course, we shouldn't be encouraging people to be wearing bodysuits like that no matter what their size are, because that's sexualizing. We don't want to be encouraging that. It encourages the dysfunction and the breakdown and the degradation of our society. We want to be a moral and a just and a civil society. Whereas this is just saying, well, we can do what we want because we take over history. We can do what we want because we are the new class. We're fighting for what we get, what we're entitled to have. We can break down society and we can break down culture because we're better. No, you're not. You're not better. You're encouraging the moral destruction of not only North America, but the world. The more, like, if she had just posted the regular video that she had played, where she went into the Library of Congress and she played the crystal flute, wearing what she's wearing in this, which is totally non-controversial, that would have been fine. Because she actually has skill as a flautist. And she would be respecting the history. She would be respecting the accomplishments. Even though James Madison, yes, he had slaves. But in writing the United States Constitution, in writing and being a part of the development of the state of the nation of the United States, he built something truly great. And yes, he was gifted this flute as a tribute to his accomplishments. And all this was saying, yep, this is our way of reclaiming history. And twisting it and manipulating it to our culture. I'm not going to have that. Nobody should have that. I encourage you to actually watch the video of her playing it in the National Library. She's actually quite good. But when she's trying to sexualize, when she's trying to pervert, then she loses everything all her ability. She didn't showcase how good of a flautist she was in that video. She played 2 notes and then shakes her butt. That's all she did. She's like, I just made history because I twerked while holding a knight invitation. No. It's just despicable how far and how depraved our culture has become. And I don't want it to go any further. We stand on the precipice of a culture war. Of a culture war devolving into a civil war. Not only in the United States, but also here in Canada. Our society is broken. And glorifying people like this It's only making it worse. But the final story in the news you may have missed. Alberta commands RCMP to ignore Ottawa's firearms confiscation measures. Pretty much the only good thing that Tyler Shandro has done. He was formerly the health minister, and he was a disgrace. So the Alberta government will intervene on the ongoing challenges of the Trudeau government's firearms ban to take action to prevent Ottawa from conscripting Alberta RCMP officers to collect those firearms. Shandro says the Public Safety Minister Marco Mendocino asked the province to help confiscate 30,000 newly restricted firearms beginning this fall. Those firearms were purchased legally and the province will not aid the federal government in confiscating them, Shandro said. The province will also go a step further and seek to intervene in 6 ongoing judicial review applications challenging the constitutionality of the federal firearm prohibition legislation. As interveners, we will be able to offer the courts arguments based on the specific challenges the federal legislation has created for Alberta's law-abiding firearms community and the advanced legal arguments the federal government has overreached with its plan to ban 1,500 models of firearms. So, of course, May 2020, Trudeau announced that he was banning more than 1,500 model of firearms, including AR-15s, owners of these guns with a 2-year amnesty period, to come into compliance with the prohibition he set at the time. And of course, they plan on spending $250 million buying back the guns. So yes, this is something that Tyler Shandro has done that I actually agree with. Because buying back and taking and confiscating weapons by legally owned, proper abiding citizens is going to create more crime. It's going to encourage acts of criminality from thugs and awful people. Because unfortunately, in our modern society, how do you prevent crime? By being able to defend yourself. There are multiple statistics to prove this. An armed population, unfortunately for those who want to confiscate guns, is a safe society. Now, I don't have any guns with me right now. All my guns are at the farm. Because don't really need them in the city. Because in the city, especially in a moderately safe community, the police are actually on call to protect you, and they can get to you in a decent amount of time. But if the city police is overstretched, or in a rural area, especially like near my grandmother's house, where there's no town for 20 miles, then you need to have a gun. You need to have something to protect yourself in case somebody with malintent is coming to harm you. Is coming to harm your family. Being able to protect oneself is not wrong. Unfortunately, Trudeau and his lackeys do believe that it is wrong to use firearms to defend oneself. He said that in an interview just a few months ago. He's like, yep, no, Canadians don't have a right to defend themselves using firearms. It's like, well, what else are we going to defend ourselves? Knives? Sticks? This guy is a tyrant. We've talked about this many, many times. What he's doing is trying to disarm the populace. And then eventually, if he decides to take more serious control measures, like he did when he invoked the Emergencies Act, which I really don't see any restriction to why he wouldn't do that again, if he sees fit. The RCMP have never really stood up and did anything against him. So it has to be the average citizen saying, nope, we're going to stand up for what we have. We're going to stand up against those who seek to harm us. And in really drastic situations, we're going to stand up against a corrupt and evil government who is seeking to take away what we have fought for. But speaking of a corrupt and evil government that is seeking to take away what people have fought for, oh boy, let's talk about the douche of the week. Because the New Zealand Prime Minister is doing that to the nines. All right, so the douche of the week is Jacinda Ardern. Now, for those who do not know who Jacinda Ardern is the New Zealand Prime Minister who was condemned for calling to regulate free speech as a weapon of war at the United Nations. So she warned about disinformation online at the United Nations General Assembly. So let's just watch her video. We're going to watch the whole 2 minutes because it's just that messed up.
This week we launched an initiative alongside companies and non-profits to help improve research and understanding of how a person's online experiences are curated by automated processes. This will also be important in understanding more about mis- and disinformation online, a challenge that we must, as leaders, address. How do you tackle climate change if people do not believe it exists? How do you ensure the human rights of others are upheld when they are subjected to hateful and dangerous rhetoric and ideology? The weapons may be different, but the goals of those who perpetuate them is often the same: to cause chaos and reduce the ability of others to defend themselves, to disband communities, to collapse the collective strength of countries who work together. But we have an opportunity here to ensure that these particular weapons of war do not become an established part of warfare. In these times, I'm acutely aware of how easy it is to feel disheartened. We are facing many battles on many fronts, but there is cause for optimism, because for every new weapon we face, there is a new tool to overcome it. For every attempt to push the world into chaos is a collective conviction to bring us back to order. We have the means. We just need the collective will.
Yikes. Yikes. That is horrifying. So, she acknowledges that calling to regulate speech online in any way can seem problematic. As leaders, we are rightly concerned that even the most light-touch approaches to disinformation could be misinterpreted as being hostile to the values of free speech that we value so highly. Well, you don't value free speech. But while I cannot tell you today what the answer is to this challenge, I could say with complete certainty that we cannot ignore it. To do so poses an equal threat to the norms we all value. So what you're saying is, Jacinda Ardern, is that, yep, you can have free speech, but if you only share the narratives that we don't oppose. She asked the audience how they could tackle various challenges that people are allowed to share opposing narratives online. That's part of civil discourse, you fascist witch! After all, how do you successfully end a war if people are led to believe the reason for its existence is not only legal but noble? How do you tackle climate change if people do not believe it exists? How do you ensure the human rights, blah, 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 blah. All of this is to say, yep, my values are supreme, I am part of the establishment, and I am going to try and push to control what people say, because if people disagree with me, then they should be punished because they are using, as she says, weapons of war. Having an opposing viewpoint is not a weapon of war. We talked about this so many times. What the left idealizes and idolizes is the idea that if someone has an opposing viewpoint, that, oh, well, we're the left. We don't have to fight it, but what we are going to do is we are going to censor it, we're going to silence it, and we're going to make sure that anyone who holds that viewpoint is gaslit as a terrorist, as a threat to democracy, as someone who is actively engaging in violence and warfare and terrorism against the noble and the virtuous who just say, yes, Jacinda, we're going to agree with everything you say, Jacinda. Oh, Miss Ardern, please benefit us with your great wisdom. That's not how we should be behaving. If you can't defend your own viewpoints, then those viewpoints are not worth having. She says that those who spread misinformation and disinformation are weapons. And they choose to use it to cause chaos and reduce the ability of others to defend themselves, to disband communities, to collapse the collective strengths of countries who work together. She would say that against those who opposed masking, against those who opposed mandatory vaccinations. Because what did she do in her country in New Zealand? She locked it down and put it into a permanent military police state. Because that's what fascists do. And then she says, yep, we have tools. There is a cause for optimism because with every new weapon we face, there is a new tool to overcome it. Guess what that new tool is? Stuff like destroying social media platforms. Stuff like social credit systems. Stuff like deplatforming. This is the stuff that the establishment and people like Jacinda Ardern want to use because they want to make sure that anyone who disagrees with them is pushed into the fringe. But if you push people into the fringe, if you push individuals who are, say, centrist, who have fairly rational views, but they don't agree with the narrative that the mainstream is trying to push, people like Jacinda Ardern would push them into the fringe. But if you actually went with a more classically liberal, more conservative viewpoint and saying, yep, we have a disagreement. Let's talk it out. Let's hash it out. Let's each come to a compromise because we each have different beliefs, but we can each defend those beliefs rationally. If you have a rational discourse about how to make society better, that will actually make society better. Whereas if you're going to censor and you're going to silence and you're going to oppress and enslave and imprison those who disagree and those who participate in wrongthink, then you're no better than the Soviets. You're no better than the Nazis, because what you are doing is you are saying, yep, I am supreme and everyone else can shut up. Everyone else. And if you try and say, yep, well, I don't think you're right, they're going to imprison you. Jacinda Ardern did that with those who disagreed with the COVID narrative. She put them in COVID camps. So did Australia. They had the most draconian policies against COVID in the world, and they didn't do squat. Jacinda Ardern, you are an evil fascist witch. And I hope that no one listens to what you have to say, because what you're doing will hurt and it will kill many people. Because just like what happened a few weeks ago with that man who ran over a kid, calling him a Republican extremist, when you gaslight and when you attack your opponents as using weapons of war and being terrorists, then any action against those people. This individual, yes, he was drunk when he ran over that kid, but when he had his bail hearing, he was upset that he was even being given the chance, being forced to pay $50,000 bail, because it was going to upset his lives. It was going to put his family by the wayside. Yes, when you run and you maim and you drive over someone, yes, you should be punished, unless that individual is actively participating in violence against you. Which, seeing as how the kid didn't have a weapon and he drove him over running after him in a car, that's not likely. But that's what Jacinda Ardern wants. She wants to push those who disagree to the fringe, and then she wants to make sure that they're punished to the fullest extent. Because she only wants a society of those who agree. It's not about tolerance. It's not about diversity. If it's about diversity, it's only about diversity of skin color. But if you hold the wrong belief, then you are the enemy. And that's not a system that I can endorse. And that's not a system that anyone should endorse. But that's basically how we're going to end today's show. And that's why Jacinda Ardern is the douche of the week. So, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being involved in the chat. Again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be actively involved in it really all that much, just because I'm trying to read off the stories and I can't read the stories in the chat at the same time. It's just something I can't do. But Danny will be back next week. Hopefully we can have a more decent discussion and we can keep track of the chat better. So, that being said, if you're following us on our video platforms such as YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, and YouTube, then, of course, like, share, comment, subscribe, and leave us a comment. Let us know how we're doing. Or if you have any questions, if you have any commentary about the show, if you want to be on the show at some time, especially if you disagree. If you want to come on the show if you disagree, please do. Everybody that wrote us a bad review on any of these things, We're like, come on the show. We'll debate you. If you say that we're wrong, we would love to know why. But that being said, if you're following us on our text platforms, then share, echo, follow, comment. It's different for all these text platforms between Facebook, Gitter, Twitter, and Parler. But those who are on those platforms already know that. All right. Here at the Shrewd Dudes podcast, we'd like to remind you, why be rude when you can be shrewd? We'll see you on Tuesday for our regularly scheduled Tuesday News Day. Until then, have a great weekend, have a great night, and as always, God bless.